So I'd like to invite the panel, which is nicely teed up by David Eaglesham's talk, on what we can do with carbon. So carbon capture and utilization, turning a pollutant into a product. Our moderator for this panel is Professor Andrew Bocarsly from the chemistry department here at Princeton University. His research is focused on electrochemistry and photoelectrochemistry, and he provided me some slides for my lecture on photoelectrochemistry. Thank you. And Professor Bocarsly, take it away.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So, I was really excited about that last talk in terms of the idea of cheap electricity, because as an electrochemist who wants to make things, chemical things from electricity, cheap electricity is critical. But I was even more excited by the very last slide, which had the four little letters on it, CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, because that's what we want to talk about now. So we just heard that one way we can lower our carbon diet is to simply generate less CO2 in the atmosphere, and there were some wonderful strategies for doing that. But of course, there's a lot of CO2 out there, and it's not all that likely, no matter how optimistic you are, that even if we want to lower our carbon budget, that we're going to do it instantaneously. So we have a lot of CO2 to deal with, and the panel that we have today is going to address that issue. What do we do with all the CO2 we have, and the CO2 that we'll probably continue to make for at least some little time into the future? And I was really delighted that, actually, I was really delighted that everybody I asked, with one caveat, said yes to come to my panel. I got my top speakers, with one exception, that is, every chemist I asked said no. They were busy. They didn't say no, they just were very busy. So I'm playing two roles today. I'm going to moderate this panel, but I'm your lone chemist speaking on the panel also. So what I'd like to do is, what we're going to do this is each panelist is going to come up and make a little presentation on their area, and then we'll take some seats here and try and interact with you. So, of course, if you want to utilize carbon dioxide, if you want to do some chemistry to turn it into something else, the first thing you need is carbon dioxide. You have to capture it. So we have Alissa Park, who is a professor in the Department of Chemical Engineering at Columbia. She is the Lenfest chair, and she's the director of the Lenfest Center for Sustainable Energy, and she is an expert on carbon capture. So she'll be telling us something about her work in that area. Following that, we have Peter Styring, who is another chemical engineer, sort of. He's actually a chemist, pretending to be a chemical engineer. So Peter has a PhD in chemistry, just to set the role straight here. He has actually served as the head of the chemistry department at Sheffield University, but he seems to alternate that with being in the Department of Chemical Engineering at Sheffield University, and he thinks big about doing CO2 things, so that's appropriate for chemical engineering. He also in recent years, has taken on a very important role in terms of advising industry and in particular European political entities into the possibilities for utilizing carbon and for the costs associated with not utilizing carbon. So he'll give us more of a techno-economic sort of perspective on things. And then that is going to be followed by Quance. Gay Wynn is the real thing. She's not waiting around for a carbon tax. She is CEO of Solid Carbon Products. Her company is taking carbon dioxide today and turning it into a variety of forms of elemental carbon that have immediate uses. So she's going to tell us how you do this, because she's done this. She's also been very involved in interacting with the U.S. Department of Energy on issues of policy and business in generating an industry based on carbon or CO2. And then finally, I will come in at the end with, again, your lone electrochemist and talk about some possibilities that we're looking at here at Princeton in terms of electrochemically converting CO2 into various useful chemical products. So with that, I'd like to introduce Alissa, who oh, there she is. I lost her. The podium is yours.
So this is going to be a little interesting because you can put it up, the slides. Yeah, that's fine. So the front slides are very similar. So unfortunately, the one I sent her was the one I just gave 2 days ago to Earth Institute at Columbia. I already had the one for Princeton and with a lot of capture slides. So you end up getting something about urban cities. So I'm not sure what to do about it, but I will wing it. Sorry about that. So as Andy talked about, I do a lot of research in carbon capture, and I spilled over towards the storage and as well as utilization, and that's where I come in. And at Columbia University, they're very interested in urban cities these days. So let's look at this. Some of the slides are similar. So these are the reports came out about 2013, 14, around that time. And I've been working in this field since 2000. And I think that's the time people start to get really frustrated. After 2 decades of working really hard in the area of carbon management, CCUS, why don't we have it? And I think that's where we started. And people were quite scared when this report came out from National Academies and IPCC that maybe they said, well, we're done. We should not even bother with this, and then maybe we should just focus on renewable energy. And instead, what they came up with, they said that we need substantial multi-century climate change commitment created by past, present, and future emissions. It's really simple, sounds simple, but a very, very big challenge when you talk about this. The reason is when you talk about the pollutants, you want to go to zero emission. You stop the emission. That's what you want. But these 4-letter word right here, the past, what did we do with the CO2, which was emitted in the past? It would be nice if it was a landfill. We know exactly where it is. Unfortunately, it was airfield into the atmosphere at a very low concentration. So going back to the history and picking them up is a big, huge challenge. So in a sense that after this report came out, people were excited. We understand this is one of the biggest challenges faced by humanity, but we are willing to do it. So this is the mission innovation. I don't know whether you're familiar with. COP21, Paris Agreement, all of you heard a little bits and pieces of that. And at the time, ministries of 22 countries and EU got together and said that this CCUS, or carbon management, or climate change itself is not a bridging technology. It's really long bridge or even just future technologies. Meaning that not only we need to do commercialization tech to market, but we really need to advance fundamental science in this area. And that was really interesting because how many times the entire globe got together and say, let's really push for fundamental science and engineering to be pushed, which was really interesting. So they came up with, for climate change, 8 different areas. So starting from these 7 to start with, and then third one is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And last one was added a year later, which is on hydrogen. So when you look at all these areas, I'm not going to go into detail, many of them are kind of interconnected. So for example, so I guess I don't have it here. So here, what have is that if you want to make, for example, CCUS, you can actually make construction materials and making building more efficient, or you can also convert sunlight and then capture CO2 and make chemicals and fuels and store energy into dense energy carrier. So there's a lot of interconnection between these areas, and this really gave us a good understanding of where we should go at the time. So that meeting was for CCUS. We had a workshop in 2017. The report came out 2018. You can download from online, saying that it's not a roadmap, it's a vision statement. So if you look at the carbon capture, utilization, and storage, once you capture CO2, you have to inject into geological formations. And this is the really famous plot from Sally Benson at Stanford. Basically, she was telling you that, well, if you inject CO2, you'll be captured or stored underground in different trapping mechanisms. And one of the little plot right here is a mineral trapping. And basically what she's saying is if you inject the CO2 at the right reservoir, you can even make solid carbonates, which was quite interesting. And that kind of ties to CO2 utilization we want to talk about today. Because once you capture CO2, this is what DOE's map. And you don't need to read all these little letters, because what they're saying is that there are a gazillion different things you can do with it or make things with. So if you look around this room, it'll be really hard for you to find anything does not have carbon in it. So in fact, you cannot decarbonize the chemical or materials sector, right? Without carbon, you can't have chemicals or materials. You can only defossilize. So how to deal with the better carbon, which is non-fossil, became a huge issue. So what should we make? There was a McKinsey study in 2016. This was published saying that in terms of revenue, what are the maybe top 5 materials we should make? And if you look here, there's a concrete, fuels, aggregates, polymers, and methanol. And it seems like it's something you can kind of guess. But what we're really interested in is the environmental side of it. So we converted that to what is the CO2 emission reduction? And these are the numbers. Top 5 are still top 5. It does not mean these are the only materials we should make, but at least this has a huge market we should not ignore. So having said that, people are looking into carbonate side quite a bit because that goes into built environment, and I think a previous speaker was talking about what to do with this is really hard to decarbonize sectors, which is steel and cement, and it goes together with this. This is one of the really interesting study done by Columbia University, my colleagues. They actually injected CO2 in reservoir in Iceland, and then trying to see how fast this reaction happened. Kind of thinking of this Earth as a reactor system. And you see these crystals, they were able to get it done less than 2 years, which was kind of good. But you don't want to wait 2 years to make these materials. So in fact, in my research group and many other people are started to looking into, is there materials we can carbonate and then put CO2 away as solid form so that you don't need to worry about monitoring and all that so on. And if you look here, if you want to capture and store CO2 in large amount, you have to go to natural materials like silicate minerals, like what my colleagues did. But there are very unique low-hanging fruit or unique partners right here. So these are the industrial waste, which has high metal content, like a calcium and magnesium. And they're interesting because they also emit a lot of CO2. These are point sources of CO2. So in fact, they have a co-location of huge amount of CO2 emission and a lot of solid waste, which has high alkalinity. So by putting them together, maybe we can do something. And that became kind of push from the industrial side, which is kind of unusual, having all this industry coming to you and say, can you do something? It was kind of interesting. The reason is China versus Germany. This is really clear picture. If you look here, this is what's happening in steel slag in Germany versus China. Without looking into all the details, look at the yellow color. Yellow color is how much slag are being landfilled. So in China, there's a huge amount, and China is the one making most of the steel, so that they get all this ore out into their country, and the only steel goes out, and then a lot of materials are left over. So we've been developing a lot of technologies on this area, and in fact, I work with the Baotou Steel in China, in Inner Mongolia. The reason I'm really interested in their particular steel slag was because they're sitting on one of the world's largest deposit of rare earth elements. So I was thinking, well, if they have their own coal and ore, maybe their waste stream has REE in it. So that's what we've been working on. In fact, it was. So in fact, we can make construction materials or high-value filler materials using calcium carbonate, magnesium carbonate, while recovering a lot of rare earth elements. And if you look here, these are the photos I took. This is not even numbered top 10 steel company in China. They actually have enough slag to cover 1/3 of a Tribeca every 4 years. This is one of the tiny plants in China. So this is actual plants we have in Inner Mongolia. I can't believe we actually did it. So these are not the reactors. These are just solvent tanks. The reactor itself is right in here. So I think this is one of the success stories we've been having, that we can combine CO2 with some other unconventional resources. We can store and utilize CO2 in large quantity and hopefully decarbonize or defossilize the cement industry a little bit. So what other things we are doing in urban cities? We actually got new funding from NYSERDA, and this NYSERDA is now asking us to convert waste concrete back to concrete. Kind of interesting on site. There are other areas people are really looking into. construction materials, and also waste to, instead of calling it waste to energy, now they're calling it waste to materials, and energy becomes a byproduct. Kind of interesting. Another area was, I think, as talked about, is BECS, bioenergy and carbon capture and storage. That's one of the negative emission technologies. One of the technology we are looking at is, can we convert wet and salty biomass, which is really people don't like to work with, can we convert that into hydrogen? And that's one of the green hydrogen we can make, and can we do that while capturing CO2? And that's another technology we're developing. So finally, I'm gonna cover with what Andy's gonna talk about, which I was supposed to talk about this most of the today, was that what would you do with CO2 capture? And I think until now, for 2 decades, we were only looking at, or really focusing on, capturing CO2 from coal-fired power plant. But that is kind of past story now, right? Because we did do the fuel switching so quickly as soon as we had a shale fracking. So most of the power plant reduced the CO2 emission very quickly because now we are burning natural gas, not coal. So we need to look at not only coal-fired power plant, we should think about even direct air capture all the way to maybe even cement plants. We have to look at a wide range of CO2 sources, and once you capture them, this is kind of for the first time that renewable energy and CCUS field can work with each other, because they need to store energy. At the same time, we want more carbon-free energy to manage carbon for the future. And this is one of the picture of direct air capture, and hopefully we'll be able to defossilize the chemical and material sector as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone for staying to the end. It's been a really inspirational day. And actually, I'm being interviewed next week for the National Decarbonisation Champion in the UK. And you've given me a lot of inspiration today that I'm getting the message across that's right. So I want to talk about CO2 utilisation, but I want to talk about not just the chemistry, not just the chemical engineering, but the politics and the life cycle assessment, the environmental impacts and the techno-economics. I've got an additional role, which is the Associate Fellow in the Understanding of Politics, which for the last 5 years has been hell, as the world goes mad. But Britain is now starting to catch up. I was part of Mission Innovation with Alissa. We wrote we were co-authors of the report. It's now time to implement it. We talk about 2050. That's too late. We talk about 2040. That's too late. IPCC says 2030. We can just about make that, I think, but we need positive action now. We need to get things moving. We need to use technologies that are already in place. I took this quote from Albert Einstein. He seems to be quite popular this week. The world will not evolve past its current stage of crisis by using the same thinking that created the situation. We have to do something absolutely radical. And part of that, as the IPCC have said, is cutting off the supply. So fossil carbon coming into the supply chain is not going to help. If you've got a wound, which is leaking blood, you cut off the blood supply to stop that, and then you treat it. And that's what CCUS aims to do. So the waste hierarchy by Lansink was produced in the Netherlands, in the Dutch government. And you can apply this to CCUS. So if you think about reuse, you're talking about CCU. If you're thinking about recycling, you're talking about CCU. The carbon that is a waste now becomes a commodity. Energy production, again CCU, but EOR. EOR has sneaked in as a utilization technology. It is not a low carbon technology because you're producing more fossil carbon. So we try not to include EOR in any of our methodologies. Disposal, CCS, and you can put EOR in there. But landfill, the worst thing you can possibly do is CCS. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't do CCS. I'm saying you need to do everything. We still need to landfill waste, but we also recycle waste. But what we really need to do is reduce the amount of waste coming into the system, so no new fossil carbon. And that is a huge task. And it's not just the chemistry, it's not just in the engineering, but it's also policy. Carbon tax is one of them. Tax does work. In the UK, we put a 5p tax on single-use plastic bags. Within 1 year, we'd reduce consumption by 95%. That is a huge reduction. If we can do that with carbon, then we can get a long way towards decarbonising the world. So what can you do with carbon dioxide? I was told that carbon dioxide was unreactive, that we should only concentrate on using amine capture. And I said, well, amine capture is chemistry, but you're making a product which you don't want, which you then decompose with a lot of energy to get the amine back. So why don't you use the CO2 utilization as the capture step, so reactive capture? And then the question is, what can you do? Well, you need CO2. You also need renewable energy, and it's key that it's renewable energy and not fossil-based energy. We can make polymers. So Covestro in Germany are making polyurethane polyols. That's going into mattresses and foams. We can make chemical intermediates. I'm currently working with Unilever on replacing their surfactant stock using carbon which is recycled. Fertilizers, we've seen the Haber-Bosch process today. We've just finished a process where we're making urea and ammonium nitrate on site. It's more effective than making urea and then transporting it and using it. We can make alternative feedstocks, energy, fuels. We're still going to fly planes. We're still going to drive big trucks. We still need a diesel replacement. We need something that will replace diesel, but with lower emissions and lower environmental impact. And DME is one of the key intermediates there, and the OMEs. So Ford Motor Company and Oberon Fuels in California are highlighting that. Advanced materials, carbon fibers, carbon nanoparticles. This is a great source, and we'll hear about that later. Pharmaceuticals, healthcare, consumer products, they all use carbon. Everything, practically everything we use, uses carbon. That's just a rough idea of some of the things that you can do with carbon. You can make polymers, you can make cyclic carbonates that go into batteries. I'm interested in this top bit here, where you can make alkanes and alkenes and carbon monoxide. These are feedstocks for the chemical industry. These are materials that will change the way the chemical industry works. So, carbon dioxide utilization not only captures the CO2 and reuses it, but it stops new fossil carbon entering the supply chain. And therefore, you've got a double benefit. You're reducing the CO2, the new carbon coming into the system by effectively 2 times minus the energy consumption. How you get to that is tricky. We need pull from industry. We need industry to say to governments, this is what we need to do. This is how we're going to create a renaissance in the chemicals industry. But we need the government push as well through taxation and incentives. In the UK, the government subsidises oil and gas by £11 billion a year, just to keep more carbon entering the supply chain. If we could gradually transition away from that, we're creating new jobs in new technologies, which is the whole aim of the subsidies, but we're reducing the reliance on the fossil carbon. We can go for carbon capture from power stations. We can go for carbon capture from steel and cement, much higher concentrations. We can also do the carbon capture from direct air capture. And I have a project at the moment working on direct air capture, which is going to produce jet fuel. The cost is going to be prohibitive, but I'm going to show that we can do it. The problem is, you're talking about 1,000 times lower concentration in air than there is in a flue gas. So you need more energy to do that. So we need new chemistry to produce new materials to bring that cost down and take the efficiency up. I'm also working with Tata Steel and British Steel and Liberty Steel to decarbonize the iron and steel industry. And that is through capturing the gases from the emissions, from the blast furnace, from other parts of the plant, and converting it into fuel using hydrogen that we produce using electrolyzers, so PEM electrolyzers, which will then produce ground transportation fuel, which will allow the site to operate effectively at negative emissions. But we need to do this quickly. We need to do this in the next few years. This is not something we can sit on. The potential is huge. So Alissa showed the Global CO2 Initiative report. We've done a report slightly, I think 1 year before that, which is shown there. And we, using conservative estimates, conservative scenarios, say by 2050, you can capture and use enough CO2 to account for the whole EU emissions. And you're getting very close to the USA emissions and the world carbon capture emissions. People say that carbon capture and utilization cannot work at scale. At the moment, we're talking a market of about 250 megatons per annum compared to about 40 gigatons emissions. It's small, it's tiny. But 250 is more than CCS is doing at the moment. CCS is doing 40 megatons, and if you exclude EOR, it's doing about 2.5 megatons. So CCU is currently 10 times the amount of carbon reuse as is stored. Neither are enough. We need to accelerate both. We need to look at chemicals that we can easily produce at scale and at a reduced environmental impact. I put diesel in there, I put kerosene in there, I put chemicals. There are 10 key chemicals. Polymers, waste mineralization, as Alissa talked about, there is a vast market there. I put methane in there in 2015. I don't believe that anymore, because the value of methane is less than the value of hydrogen that you need to produce the methane. And hydrogen is key for many of these processes. So what's been said today has been really inspirational. The use of hydrogen, the use of renewable energy, PV, everything has to come together to create the perfect storm. Thank you.
I almost don't know where to start. Thank you. This room cares. And this is a personal story for me. Damn it. Okay. What if it were possible that CO2 were so profitable as a feedstock that we could reuse it? What if through the reuse of CO2 as a feedstock, we could displace current sources of carbon, current ways of doing business that release massive quantities of CO2 into the atmosphere? What if we could avoid CO2 emissions by rebaselining the technology used to make the majority of the carbon used in the world today? Solid carbon products makes CO2 profitable. We're going to make a difference. He's fine. The reason why we started this, and I can't believe I'm standing up here crying, the reason why we started this is because that's our son, and he deployed to Iraq. 2007. IEDs were decimating the U.S. Armed Forces, and his dad said, I got to make better armor. Best armor in the world is made out of high aspect ratio carbons. They cost over $100,000 a ton. The U.S. Delta Force Army armor does not even use them. So his dad said, this is crazy. It's carbon. There's got to be a better way. So he invented a better way. You take CO2 as a feedstock, industrial grade, you combine it with hydrogen or methane, and all that you get out, using the noise process named after his dad, is nanoscale carbons and distilled water. Pretty cool, huh? Really cool. It's closed loop. It is profitable at scale. It can displace the carbon black industry. Where do we get our CO2 from? I don't care. Just make it industrial grade. Wait a minute, we were talking earlier about decarbonizing the iron, the steel. Couldn't be done. Steel industry could not be decarbonized. What about, whoops, I'm trying to find the pointer. Well, screw the pointer. Industry and waste management right there. If you have a steel industry, the nature of the steel industry is they use coke. That coke gets converted into CO2. There are two ways of making steel: blast furnace, electric arc. The electric arc is a massive graphite electrode that gets converted into CO2. Wait a minute. What if instead of coke, which is just carbon made by converting a fossil fuel, what if instead of coke, you could use CO2 converted into carbon? We're in the process of qualifying our material as coke. What if instead of electric arc furnaces being run on graphite that is mined and heavily processed to achieve that sort of electrode, you use an electrode made out of CO2, carbon made from CO2. We can decarbonize the steel industry. Getting there, one thing at a time. So what you're seeing there are all the sources of CO2. You give me an industry emission of CO2, you scrub it down to industrial grade, I will give it back to you as carbon. Our process, Carbonomics, has looked at our process. Carbonomics is a company that does carbon credit calculations, carbon methodology. They have looked at our process. It is a net reduction. Wait a minute. You're saying that the current carbon black industry, 14 million tons a year, every ton of carbon black made releases 2.5 tons of CO2? Instead, we can use CO2 to make carbon black? Yes, our material is in test at 2 different carbon black manufacturers. Our material is proving to be a drop-in replacement for current grades of carbon black. A tire manufacturer is evaluating our carbon fiber. They like it. The last email said, keenly interested in adopting your technology. So how big is this market? This is the small part of the market. Carbon black, 14 million tons a year. High purity carbon, that's synthetic graphite. Oh, I didn't mention that. We can convert our carbon into high purity synthetic graphite. It is past testing to be used in lithium-ion batteries. That matters in the US. There's no domestic supply of graphite in the US, not for lithium-ion battery grade. Carbon fibers, yeah, we make them too. That's a $25 billion a year market. When we're operating at scale, this is a forward-looking statement. When we're operating at scale, 5,000 ton a month scale, that's 2 orders of magnitude from where we are now, we deliver a higher profitability than the current manufacturing method to make carbon black. Current manufacturing method to make carbon black is the partial controlled combustion of a heavy fraction of oil. So not only are we going to be able to save partial combustion of oil, we're also saving the CO2 emissions. Sounds like a win-win, doesn't it? Okay, where was that slide I saw earlier that said, but? Okay, small company, started in the basement. We have taken no government money. That is about to change. We have done it on private money, our money. The steps to get to first revenue, we're not at first revenue yet. Can you believe it? We're not at first revenue. We have 26 US patents, 34 international ones. We are in licensing conversation with Fortune 500 companies, but we haven't made a penny yet. But has our material gone through acceptance testing? Yes. We can't sell anything because we're making such a small volume. No supplier can commit to using our material yet, because when you can only supply 0.3 of a ton a month, nobody can commit a product line to it. Our next scale of operation is 50 ton a month. We're in the process of raising money for it. But part of why I was on the panel today was to talk about why and how it's difficult to bring new technologies to bear. We're doing this off private money. It is not easy, guys. It takes a special form of insanity. I encourage you, those of you, how many in here are entrepreneurs? Show of hands. Okay, how many people are inventors? Okay, how many people want to be entrepreneurs? All right, okay. recognize it is a special form of insanity, particularly when you are bringing a new chemical process to bear. This is not lines of code that you can sit at one lousy laptop. This is, under that little regulatory circle, that was 6.5 years of discussion with the EPA. Guess what? We got a significant new use rule, permission to manufacture, that is unprecedented. We have no capacity cap. I can start to make this and never stop. And that water that we have as a byproduct, that can be released to the surface. So it's an unprecedented, it is the most environmentally positive technology that has come into being. And we are financially stressed beyond all measure, because when you go back to what David and Jeff said, which is to go from pilot scale to commercial scale, that valley of the shadow of death, oh man, it's brutal, I'm in it. It is almost beyond brutal for a small company to take the step from proven science, proven engineering, patents. You've got your regulatory approval, you've got your market, you've got your potential customers. Tire companies saying we're keenly interested, but I have to make them 7 tons of material for them to do their final acceptance test because they want to do a full run of tires using our material. I can't make 7 tons with a 0.3 ton a month unit. Did I mention this valley of the shadow of death? So where are we now? Funding. Funding. The conversations that I've heard today about policy change, government support, because there's a point at which the mission matters. This one matters. So, how are we going to change the carbon economy? We're going to have a lot of fun. Okay, on the right-hand side, you see the CO2 producers. That's oil companies. That's also cement factories. That's anybody that makes a petrochemical or combusts a petrochemical. They have a CO2 feedstock. Folks in the middle, those are carbon producers. Those are folks like Cabot Carbon. All the carbon black producers in the world, there are only 5 of them that make almost 50%. Those 5 carbon producers in the world all combust a petrochemical. In other words, they're customers of the folks under the CO2 producers. Let's go to the right-hand side, the carbon users. 70% of the world's carbon black goes into tires. The rest goes into inks and plastics and colors. Anything you see is black has oil soot in it. It could have CO2 in it instead, okay? So when you look at those 3 columns and you start to pretend that you're going to change the world, then you say, what CO2 producers are essential for our way of moving forward? At this point, frankly, cement's still pretty essential. So how about we say all the CO2 from the cement producers is converted to carbon using the noise process and delivered directly to the carbon users. Oh, sorry about that, you guys in the middle. Okay? We can do fundamental geopolitical economic changes if there is the will. What I am so excited by is the conversations earlier today where we saw the PV field change and deploy quickly. I don't want to sell this to one entity. I want this broadly adopted. I would love to be able to free source the patents, and I'm hoping within 5 years to be able to free source the patents, but I have investors I have to pay back right now, and I have to get to commercial scale operation. That's the basement. That's the pilot production. That's the motley crew that we're pretty diverse. And this is our son coming home from his last deployment in Iraq. Thank you.
Wow. This has nothing to do with chemistry or with carbon for a moment, but a few years ago, I organized some talks on campus that had to do with teaching the STEM subjects. And it turns out the way I positioned myself, I ended up speaking right after an English professor. And he came up, and he had written a poem, an original poem on the topic we were talking on, and it was beautiful. And I was there talking about sort of the mechanics of, you know, how you teach science and math and whatnot. And so the note to myself was, never again put yourself on a program when you're behind a really dynamic speaker. But thank you very much for those comments. I also have to say, I have been sitting here the last couple weeks thinking about doing the last steps, actually, in founding a new company that will be doing CO2 electrochemistry to form organic compounds. And I've been asking myself the question, am I crazy? Yes. So yes, you've answered it for me, so that won't stop me, but confirmation. Okay. So one of the reasons that we're doing this today is the university has just been very generous in investing in a group of us, a group of professors you can see on the left over there, to start a project that is going to mate an electrochemical reactor with a biochemical reactor. Okay, so we're going to start off. The problem is this. People that are smarter than me, that do chemical biology, know how to build bugs that will take CO2 and convert it into useful organic compounds. Okay. In order to do that, they have to eat something that's a carbon base. And one of the things that you could feed them, of course, is CO2 directly, but CO2 isn't all that soluble in water where they live, number one. And number two, I am led to believe that these nice little bugs don't really enjoy eating CO2 all that much. It's not their favorite dessert. You could go with CO. That works a little bit better, but again, the water solubility of CO is no good. So what you would like to do is convert your CO2 into a product that's highly water soluble and that your bugs would love to eat and spit out things like butanol. And so the idea that we put forward was, let's take CO2 and electrochemically convert it into a molecule like formate, which has wonderful solubility, and which electrochemically works quite well. You could set up a company today, because I've done it, that will take CO2 and generate formate from it. Okay. Formate's highly water soluble. We can apparently design biological species that will be happy eating formate. We can engineer how to interact that electrochemical system in sort of one pot with our biochemical systems. We have some wonderful water engineering that's going on there. And then we can have a system that carries out CO2 formation to a product that has a significant amount of carbon in it. Electrochemically, you really can't do that very well. You can do it, but you have two problems. One is, to date, the yield for compounds. Where's the button for, there it is, for C4 compounds? The yields are very low. In addition to that, when you're doing this electrochemically, if you're going to make something like butanol, it costs you 6 electrons for every carbon you add to the CO2 chain. So if you want to make butanol from CO2, 24 electrons. We've just heard a lot of talk about how expensive electricity is, and it's great that the price is coming down, but 24 electrons is a problem. Okay. On the other hand, I can take CO2 and turn it into formate. That only costs me 2 electrons, so a fraction of the price. And now I can feed that to the biological systems, and they don't charge me the same amount that the electrical utility does for carrying out that reduction to the desired product. So that is the strategy here. It's a project that's just starting up. We have great hopes for it, and we think that is a great way of going forward. Now, as I said, you can already make CO2 into products, and you can do it commercially, I think, that have only 1 carbon in them. So this is an apparatus that was developed by Liquid Light. Over here, it's a large lab-scale apparatus. It doesn't match up with your apparatus. This is an apparatus that can generate about 1 kilo of formate per day. All the magic, this is all infrastructure really, all the magic is happening in this electrochemical cell, 100 square centimeters of active electrode area. You can stack these together. Here's a short stack that uses 3 of those. The only power that this is being utilizing is from our local utility via solar cells. So we borrowed one of the photovoltaic arrays that you see on all the telephone poles around here, actually thanks to the Anglinger Center, and use that to run this stack. So there it is, and that's the only thing we're doing there. And you make formate, and you make it with reasonable efficiency. We can get up to about 3% thermionic efficiency for doing that, which sounds like a really poor number. And the first thing I'll say is most of that loss is due to the panel. Our cells are great. They run at 80% efficiency. Silicon, not quite as good. That's okay. There's other ways to do it, we heard. But even at 3%, we're beating natural photosynthesis by 3 times approximately. That's a very respectable number. And so this can all work, okay, but it works because we're making formate and not making an organic compound that's larger. That's where we run into a problem. I already pointed out the first problem with that, the first problem being that electricity is expensive and it takes a lot of electricity to knit those carbons together. The other issue that we have with it is we don't have good catalysts for doing it. So my laboratory actually works on developing new catalysts for making carbon-carbon bonds in electrochemical cells. And important area, but that's an area that needs development, so the electrocatalysts are a problem. So what we will be doing in the current project is we will be taking, as I said, our electrochemical cell, where we're very good at making formate. We'll take CO2 from any point source to start with that would like to give it to us. We don't think that's a particular issue. We're generating oxygen right now at our counter electrode, but actually in a final product, it turns out when you do the economic analysis, you need to make something at your anode that people would like, that you can sell to them. Simply reducing CO2 to a useful organic compound doesn't pay the bills. You need to use the remaining oxidizing power that you have to do something besides oxidizing water, presumably. It's environmentally, this sounds like a great idea. Oxygen's always a nice thing to make, but it doesn't pay the bills. Okay, once you have that, you have 2 choices. You can take that, you realize you're making it in a salty water solution with perhaps a few other magic additives to that, and you can pull the formate, which is highly water soluble, out of that at a rather large cost of energy. And then you could feed that into your bioreactor. The other alternative, what we are thinking more in terms of, you do it all in one step. So you come up with your biological system that is happy living in that salty water, and you have electrodes that can tolerate your biological system, and that is going to be, I think, a big challenge, and that biofilm formation on your electrode would be less than ideal. But that's our goal, do that. Okay, we have come up with some strategies over here by which we can immobilize our bacteria in the system so they won't destroy our electrode and still get the formate to our bacteria, and we believe that will be very efficient with the goal again of generating butanol. I'll just point out in a process like this, a 2-step process, Siemens has coupled with another company in Europe to do this to generate a production facility that's going to make butanol and hexanol. Okay. But they are going to pay the cost of the extraction process in doing that. They're doing a 2-step process. We hope to implement this new process, 1 step. Okay. Okay, very good. So with that, I want to do one other thing before I bring actually, while I'm talking, I'd like to bring the panel up here. But if you're really interested in CO2, there's an organization which both Peter and Alissa are involved with, the International Conference on Carbon Dioxide Utilization. It's been around for almost 30 years at this point, and I'm going to be hosting the meeting here, for those of you that are forward-thinking, in the summer of 2022. So you might want to put this on your calendar. It's going to be a great meeting. We're going to do everything carbon dioxide. And at this point, all I'd like to tell you, if you're interested in this sort of thing, if you will send an email with the letters ICCDU ICCDU in the header. If you'll send it to PF9 at Princeton, that will get you on our mailing list, and we'll be able to forward our flyers to you as we develop this meeting. So if that's an area of interest, please do that. At this point, I'd like to open up questions to the committee members, and who we have. Question way in the back.
How much does the ideas that you have, a lot of great ideas, depend on raising the cost of fossil fuels?
So, if you want to make a C1 product, we think you can do that today at current costs. If you want to go and start making these more exotic compounds, and probably that's where the big benefit is in CO2 utilization electrochemically, you're going to either need a lot cheaper energy source or other things are going to have to cost more. Even actually, so formate I picked out is a 2-electron process. Methanol was on one of the earlier slides. Whether or not you can make methanol this way is very controversial. That you can make it this way, no problem. But whether you can make it and get a profit out of it compared to the current techniques of making it from syngas is an issue of controversy.
To make the carbon using the noise process, the first unit, the first 50-ton-a-month unit, because we're going to be converting that carbon to synthetic graphite, and because of the characteristics that our synthetic graphite is proving, our cost of goods sold per ton is going to be under $6,000. Our cost to market of the synthetic graphite is going to be over $20,000 a ton. So we are looking at having free money of over $750,000 per month of operation of the 50-ton. The noise process does not need carbon credits to be profitable. It is absolute serendipity that it is a completely functioning business model independent of carbon credits. It means carbon credits are an extra sprinkle on the cake. Profitability will drive the adoption. Current pricing of all feedstocks into the noise process and the value of the goods coming out make it a fully profitable business. I just have to get to the 50-ton level.
I think just to add to the fuel costs, it's down to regulation as well. So if the IPCC are going to be genuinely proactive and say you have to stop using fossil oil in fuels, then governments have got to act on that. And you know, if the hydrocarbons are subsidized, then it's a case of shifting the subsidies. So if I take the UK as an example, we're looking to go to net zero by 2050. So the Committee on Climate Change has set that as the goals. They haven't set any policies for doing that. And they've said we'll achieve it by electric vehicles and carbon capture and storage. Now, electric vehicles are interesting because then you bring in social justice. Because at the moment, if I want a Tesla, we're talking, what, $50,000, $100,000. So I'm then paying to run that car and reduce my emissions in an urban environment, for example, if I'm reducing it in the city. What it's doing, because the grid mix at the moment is not significantly green. So in Britain at the moment, today, there is 10% wind power. The rest is from fossil oil and nuclear. So if I'm saying I'm going to run my Tesla, which has got 2 big batteries, which have large emissions, that emission is going to be deferred to low socioeconomic areas close to power stations. So you have to be careful when you do the emissions analysis. So if you do a full life cycle assessment, you need to take into account where those emissions are and what the associated emissions are with the other technologies. So electric car emissions at the moment are very high. So a small EV has emissions very similar to a small diesel. If you go to a hybrid car, then the emissions are much lower because you're using the battery and the fuel. I think the way forward is to bring out fuels which have lower emissions but use the same engine technology. So you're not disproportionately disadvantaging those people who can't afford a Tesla or another EV. So if you look at dimethyl ether, for example, the emissions are something like 30 grams per kilometer, which is about a tenth of a big diesel. The main problem with urban environments is the NOx emissions and the particulates. DME, which is two methyls joined together, the particulate emissions are practically zero. The NOx emissions are practically zero. So you produce a better fuel to serve the current technology, which will bring the cost of the fuel relatively down.
I think the last slide by David was a really good one to really put the numbers. Usually we don't put all the numbers together like that. Because if you want to make chemicals and fuels or decarbonize those really tough sectors, you do need hydrogen, which is green or at least blue, and those has to be cheap enough. But there were a lot of debates over whether his numbers are correct. I hope so, but those are challenging numbers. And there was a number for CO2 capture as well. So I think all these economics should be there. The carbonization, the mineral carbonation I was talking about, that's driven by industry for the solid waste management, not because of CO2. And in fact, because of that, it's already economical at this time, not for all the feedstock, but if you have interesting materials like metals or like rare earth elements, definitely it's economical. But definitely this is much smaller than our current CO2 emissions. So I think you really need to be honest with the scale, what we can do today. So I don't like picking the winners because we need to do them all, right? And then I think every single technology has a different timing as well as a different role to play. But with the 45Q and low carbon fuel standard, definitely helped a lot because a lot of companies are going into this market because of that. But I think there's a lot of but, right? So some of the clause on 45Q makes it very difficult for big companies to do it very quickly, I think, because you have to get into that market very quickly.
Another question?
If you look at the scale of utilization, particularly for carbon dioxide utilization, it's way, way smaller than how much CO2 we emit currently. So I think to solve the CO2 emission issue, at the end, you have to convince those oil companies to produce less oil. So how we can achieve that? That's kind of my biggest question. And of course, as a scientist, we're trying to push our technology, but to be honest, everyone knows the scale we can produce, whatever the chemicals you target, it's really small, okay? And if we take out the electricity, and I think some of the speakers already point out, the electricity in the United States, everywhere almost, is really dirty, okay? So we are facing this kind of challenge. So if you think about dirty electricity to convert any chemicals, is that going to address the CO2 emission issue? I think no. The answer is kind of clear.
Who would like to go first on that one? Peter.
So yeah, you've got a good point, and that's because we are at an early point in the technology deployment. So if you look at, as I said, if you look at carbon dioxide utilization, so converting CO2 into a product, we're looking at 250 megatons per annum. And I've been told that that's insignificant, we should be just doing CCS. But that is only a tenth of the value. So there's very little CCS happening throughout the world. So if we don't do utilization and we don't do sequestration, what do we do? So we have, one of the major emitters of CO2 is industry. And how do we decarbonize industry? So in Europe, there's an organization called Voltachem, which is looking to electrify industry. But that, again, relies on you having significant renewable energy to be able to address that market. Now, if you think we're going to decarbonize industry and transport and power using renewable energy think where that power is going to come from. Where are the renewable sources going to be? We heard about SF6 this morning. I did an interview with the BBC a couple of weeks ago. SF6 in the production of wind power SF6 is released into the atmosphere. CO2 has a greenhouse gas potential of 1. SF6 is 23,000. Okay, so look at the life cycle assessment. If you're releasing 1 molecule of CO2, and you're releasing 1 molecule of SF6, it's like releasing 23,000 CO2 molecules. So CO2 is a problem, but maybe the alternatives are an even bigger problem. And that's what we need to address. So the low-hanging fruit at the moment is carbon dioxide utilization, because we know we can do it. There's lots of technology in the labs. As Gawain said, the problem is the valley of death. How do you take something from bench scale to pilot scale to demonstrator scale to commercialization? There's only two ways of doing that. One is for industry to embrace the technologies and invest in changing their methodologies. And secondly, it's for government to put policy push in place to ensure that that is allowed to happen. I've done work in Canada with Ottawa, and until recently, until they elected a guy called Mini Trump, they had a $30 to $50 carbon tax, which was plowed back into CO2 utilization and sequestration. So the money generated from the carbon tax was used to promote industry. In the same way, we need to do that across the world, not just in the US, not just in Canada, but everywhere. We need to take responsibility.
So I think we have this debate a lot, of course, right? But even CCUS field, if you look at it, it's really siloed. Carbon capture are mostly chemists, material scientists, chemical engineers. Storage, mostly geochemists, geophysicists, maybe civil engineers. And conversion was usually chemists like him, a lot of catalysis people. And we didn't even go to the same conference. We didn't really talk to each other. And I think that was one of the problems, because when you look at whether any technology you introduce to the world, is it really doing good for the environment, you really need to look at the overall system boundary. And that gets really, really challenging, and not a lot of people know how to do, and Peter does really well in that area. So I think what I will say is the timing. That's very important. So if you're talking about what should we do to mitigate the climate change as much as possible, then we need to do CCS, because without turning off all the coal-fired power plant or natural gas-fired power plant, there's no way we can put all that carbon into product. That math is already done. That's not a problem. But at the same time, that's really challenging. Like Peter said, we don't have that many projects out there at this time. But also, what previous speakers talked about, it took really long time for solar PV to come where it has been. So one day, hopefully we'll get there when there's abundant, cheap, the numbers you saw from the Davis last slide, that day may come, but if we don't have technology, which takes at least 2 or 3 decades to go, this is time to start. If we don't, we'll have all these resources, but no technology to actually do stuff. So putting CC, U, and S in the same bucket, I don't know whether that's the best thing to do, because it kind of plays a very different role, but at the same time, the chemistry and technology shares a lot of expertise, and I think that's the reason it's kind of bucketed together. But utilization right now is gaining a lot of attention, because when you think about the future, our future, if we want to make sure that we don't use any fossil carbon, where would you get carbon? There are only a few options, right? So you can get it from air, right? Or ocean, or rocks, right? These are where environment kept it. And I hope that we don't burn limestone to get carbon, right? That would be kind of dumb, right, thing to do, so just keep it there. But getting it out of ocean or air, those are all really challenging. But maybe we should go there if we want to use all these carbonaceous materials. And that day comes, you need a lot of energy to do that. So, but today, I think a lot of companies are interested because the energy storage as well. So not only making chemicals and fuels, when you talk about storage of renewable energy, they want something dense, not for hours or weeks, more for seasonal variability. If you can store something at much smaller, dense energy carrier, that's really positive. And I think that's where they're investing now. Is it going to be competitive? Some markets, yes. Not all markets. But should we stop this research? I don't think so.
Is it my Hi, my name's Steve Anglin. I'm with Solar CSP, and I agree with everything you've all set up there. However, my company, we're on the industry side and the services side when it comes to decarbonization. So our main product is concentrated solar power, and we build these plants, and I just got back from Beijing last week. There's a lot of interest in decarbonization in Beijing, and that is to marry concentrated solar power to these coal plants, and there's many different things I can talk about, but I won't take too long. And they're looking to hybridize the clean steam with the brown steam, or whatever you want to call it, to reduce the amount of carbon. Even though the turbines are running at 100%, you can reduce the amount of carbon that's being belched out by carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide that's being belched out by hybridization. So you're right, there isn't a 100% solution. However, there is a real interest in decarbonization, both in the US and overseas, and that's one way to do it. So I'm not an expert like you guys. You guys are very good, but I just know what I'm seeing on the ground, and so there is money being put into that, and they're looking to do it.
You know, I think just following up on what you said and what I'm hearing the panel saying, and that is there isn't one solution. It's a very big problem with a lot of solutions and perhaps solutions that we're not even aware of today. In addition to that, if we're talking about, whether we're talking about burying the carbon dioxide in the ground or making something out of it, there's no one thing from an economic point of view that you want to do with all that carbon. I think the point, there's a huge amount of CO2 out there, and so just to use it up, however you're going to do it, you have to do a wide number of different things.
So the market always looks at cost, right? So burying it in the ground is really expensive. You've got to pipe it out, bury it. And what we do is very cost effective, and I think the cost is a big, big part of that. So I agree with you, what you're saying, but you know, we're trying to do something to help.
If you have people in China that want to convert their CO2, at Solid Carbon Products, we believe that we have a technology that has to be deployed globally. I'm already in conversation at the government level in India. I want this technology deployed, okay? Right now, China is the largest exporter of carbon black in the world. And their carbon black is not made by converting their CO2. If you have folks there that you think I should be speaking with, let me know. And that is an ask I put out to everyone. I want this technology deployed. I don't want to be a millionaire. I want this technology deployed.
Yeah,
right?
so 60% of all the carbon is produced in, well, the electricity is produced by coal in China. So there's a lot of coal plants. They're actually exporting that through the BNR process, the Belt and Road, to Southeast Asia as well. So they're building coal plants, and they're belching out a lot of stuff. But I do know, I can definitely talk to you afterwards because there's a lot of interest.
Yes, please. Thank you.
And just to add to that, in China, there's a big drive towards dry methane reformation. So that's CO2 with a greenhouse gas potential of 1, methane with a greenhouse gas potential of 24. React them together, you get syngas. So you get hydrogen without the production of water. So if you go to reverse water gas shift reactions, you get a lot of water being produced, which you don't really want because you're using a lot of hydrogen to produce the water. So dry methane reformation is a good step forward. We've done it using a plasma, and we can produce ethylene, ethane, and other carbon bond products. It was interesting, the keynote today, where hydrogen was there as one of the major uses was in hydrocracking, so the cracking of hydrocarbons to give fuels. If you use CO2 to fuel, so some guys in Oxford can do CO2 to jet fuel, you can do that selectively. You don't then have to hydrocrack. So then the price of the fuel comes down because, yes, you're using hydrogen, but you're using it in a way that is absolutely selective to what you want, rather than taking oil, which is a horrible mixture of different components, and using hydrogen to get to what you do want. So there are advantages in terms of hydrogen use and electricity use.
Hour's getting a little late, and there was a question in the back that I think we should get to. Yeah.
So this wasn't discussed at all, but it's something I've been wondering for some time is people talk about taking CO2 out of the air and how it's very difficult. Well, plants do that, and you just have to plant them, and then there you go, it grows. You can bury the tree in a strip mine, whatever, essentially put the carbon back underground. I don't ever hear anybody talking about growing plants. I don't know if this is anything that you've seen, but it just kind of, I don't understand why it's not looked at more, in the sense people say it's like $1 to plant a tree. It's like, well, that's a lot of carbon over time. And, you know, you cut the tree down, build a house with it, put it somewhere, plant a new tree where it was, and just kind of keep going with it, so.
People actually do that. There's a global effort into that. And I think one of the questions was, how many trees do we need to plant to make a dent? And I think they decided that it would be 1 billion tree, I think. And then they did the whole estimation after, I don't know how many they end up planting. But what they said was, it wasn't the right number. It has to go orders of magnitude higher. So what this says is that we have a lot more trees than we thought on Earth. So it's already doing quite a bit, but even then it's having a hard time, right? Competing with the emission we have. So in order to really help the plant biosystem, you have to plant way too many trees because it's not fast enough, even counting all the Amazon and everywhere. So should we stop doing it? No, we should plant more trees and make sure that land use is done properly. We should definitely do that. Don't lose any of those carbon sink. But at the same time, if you do direct air capture, your capture capacity goes up hugely high because we are doing chemically with the much stronger binding energy per square kilometer or something. So you can do it a lot faster. But both are good areas. Both we should do, I think. But you cannot solve all the problem, unfortunately, by planting trees. Yeah.
You know, looking at the other side of the question, so you want to get rid of CO2 using plants, but the other side of the issue is make something from the CO2. And one thing we've talked about making is fuels. And I think something else that isn't appreciated, but in the United States right now, 40% of our corn crop goes to biofuel, ethanol. So we're already doing that sort of thing. The other comment is that last slide that I showed you with our little solar stack, so running our solar cells, that was operating 3 times more efficiently than natural photosynthesis. So you do have the problem of how many trees can you plant and what land mass do you need to use in order to make a significant difference here. Whereas with the our artificial systems, you can get ahead a little bit more quickly. Now, of course, there's other issues such as, because you're going to tell me about a cradle-to-cradle analysis.
No, I'm going to mention a study from Tilburg in the Netherlands where someone did an analysis of how many trees would need to be planted to just cover the energy requirements of Europe. And it was the whole of Europe plus a bit of Russia. So Andy is completely right. Photosynthesis is not good. Photosynthesis, it works for the plant. It produces fuel for the plant. It doesn't produce fuel for us. And what we do by artificial photosynthesis or through catalysis is accelerate that process of producing fuel. So, yeah, plants are great. They also capture particulates. They do lots of other good things. But in terms of carbon capture, they don't do as well as the chemists and the engineers do. I still love plants.
And I think we have time maybe for one last question, if there is. Okay, if not, I'd like to thank our speakers. They came from great distance to be here. Maybe the words.
That brings us, thank you to the panel, and as well to Andy Bocarsly for moderating. That was really stimulating. That brings us to almost the conclusion of today's events. We have outside a reception, but before that, we have the poster awards. And these are, much like today's entire event, our annual meeting, enabled by the Princeton Affiliates partners. So that includes ExxonMobil, American Tower, PSEG as our primary sponsors. And as part of that, they also are sponsoring poster awards for our poster session that we had over lunchtime today. Now, I am really encouraged on this election week. We have had more than 100 votes. That's great. So these are real numbers. These are real numbers here. So I'm just going to get right into it. And I apologize in advance if I mispronounce your name, so let me just say that. The first poster award is for the Undergraduate Student Award. This is the PSEG Best Poster Award, and it's presented to Audrey Shi. Is Audrey here? Audrey is an undergrad class of 2020, working with Sujit Datta. The title of her poster was Polymer Flow Structures in Porous Media. Audrey. Next one, Graduate Student Poster Award. This is the American Tower Best Poster Award, presented to Li Chun Peng. Here's Li Chun, might not be here. You're here. Oh, here we go. Thank you. Li Chun is a third-year PhD student. The title for poster is Underreported Coal in Statistics, a survey-based solid fuel consumption and emission inventory for the rural residential sector in China. She's working with Denise Mazeral. Another graduate student poster award. This one sponsored by ExxonMobil. The ExxonMobil Best Poster Award goes to Joanna Schneider. Joanna. Joanna is a second-year PhD student in the Department of Chemical and Biological Engineering. She's working with Rodney Priestley and Sujit Datta. The title for poster is Colloid-Enhanced Mobilization of Immiscible Fluids. Finally, in recognition of a poster to a postdoc or researcher, this is the ExxonMobil Best Poster Award for that category. This one goes to Ali Dariyapour. Ali is a postdoc research associate working in the Energy Systems Analysis Group at the Andlinger Center for Energy and the Environment. The title of his poster was Enhancing Price Formation Process in Electricity Markets to Support Advancing High Renewable Energy Targets, a PJM Case Study. Congratulations, Ali. Congratulations to all our poster award recipients, as well as a thank you to everyone who presented a poster today. It really made the lunch a very stimulating experience. And with that, I'd like to close the meeting. Thank you all for your attendance and engagement and questions and listening and speaking, and panelists and the speakers, and invite you to a reception just outside Mader Hall here. Thank you.